Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk to you about the fact that the text matters. The text of a book matters. This seems obvious to me, but it doesn't seem obvious to certain publishers. Publishers who recently have been censoring books, altering the texts of some books by authors who have passed away. Classic books that they have decided have things that are offensive in them. And so they must change them. So, the readers, the delicate readers of today will not be offended. So this is wrong. And I've talked about this before, that this is a terrible thing, really. To alter the texts of books by authors who are dead and can no longer have a say in what these publishers are doing. It's not just wrong to the authors of these works, it's a bad thing for the rest of us too. Because it's important to know what these books actually said. What was actually written in these books? What were the attitudes of the authors who wrote these books? Because these books are more than just entertainment. They are historical documents. They preserve in their pages the attitudes and the prejudices of the times in which they were written. And that's important. And it's also important to read the book as the author wrote it, as the author intended it to be. And if you change the text, you change that. And there have been a lot of editors and a lot of scholars who have spent a lot of time to try to get the texts of certain books right. And we don't know how much work scholars and editors will have to do in the future on the texts that are being mucked around with today, especially if this practice continues. And it seems to be continuing because I keep hearing of new cases all the time, which is disturbing. But it's really important. It's important for anybody who's interested in the work of these particular authors. And what authors, who's going to be next? It could literally be anybody. And like I said, a lot of work has gone into preserving a lot of the texts of certain books and trying to figure out what texts are the ones that were preferred by the authors, because sometimes editors will change the texts of an author's work, sometimes without the author even knowing it, sometimes when the author is even still alive. And then some editor or some scholar somewhere is going to have to go through a lot of work to try to figure out, well, what was the preferred text of the author? What was the author actually trying to say? A case that comes immediately to mind, and I've talked about this before as well, but I'm going to mention it here because it's such a perfect example, and that is the case of H.P. Lovecraft and the text of H.P. Lovecraft's stories. So, with H.P. Lovecraft's stories, H.P. Lovecraft was a writer who did have a lot of prejudices, and some of that definitely slipped into his work. So he is kind of a prime candidate, I guess, in the future for his work being edited and changed, to protect all the delicate readers out there. But a lot of work has gone into trying to figure out what he actually intended in his stories, because his stories were all published in pulp magazines. Pulp magazines were the only outlet for his stories. He wrote weird stuff, H.P. Lovecraft did, so most of his stuff was published in Weird Tales and other pulps like that. And the editors of pulp magazines would frequently change stuff, and that happened to Lovecraft. Probably the most egregious examples were At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time, but many of his other stories, there were changes made when those stories were published in the pulp magazines, and also errors crept in. And then when these stories were published in hardcover from Arkham House, in the Arkham House editions originally, more errors crept in, and they used the magazine versions of the stories that, in many cases, the text was changed from what Lovecraft intended. And then when the paperbacks came out, more errors showed up, and of course they were using the now corrupted texts from Arkham House. Eventually, a scholar who was a student at the time that he did this at Brown University, S.T. Joshi, decided to look into the textual history of H.P. Lovecraft's stories, became very interested in Lovecraft's work. He found, when he consulted some of the original typescripts and manuscripts, that there were a bunch of changes and errors in the texts. So eventually, through a lot of diligent work, he corrected these texts. He went back and went to the original manuscripts and made a lot of changes to change them back to what Lovecraft intended. He basically corrected the texts. And now those corrected editions are the editions we usually read when we read a Lovecraft story. Most publishers like Penguin and the Library of America, when you read Lovecraft stories, you're reading the text that S.T. Joshi corrected. Those original corrected editions were published first in Arkham House. Years later, after S.T. Joshi had been working with H.P. Lovecraft and H.P. Lovecraft's texts for decades more, he went back to the texts, and there were some things that he went back to and rethought after working with the texts for so long and becoming familiar with some of Lovecraft's preferences. And he made some further minor changes to get back to what he thought was Lovecraft's original intention for the stories. Those were published in this, the Variorium edition. It's a word I cannot pronounce, Variorium. The Variorium edition of H.P. Lovecraft, which was published by, was it Hippocampus? Yeah, Hippocampus Press in 3 volumes. And with this edition, it'll show you just how many changes were made in some cases, because what S.T. Joshi does is he goes back to the texts and lists all the differences in all the different major publications of H.P. Lovecraft. So you can actually see in these volumes the changes that he made and why he changed them. Again, referencing the earliest known version of the stories, for example. If there's a typescript or if there's a manuscript version, he will consult those. And if the earliest version is a magazine version, say, for example, in some cases there are no manuscripts or typescripts that survive, then that's the version he has to work with. But he will go back and see if changes have been made from Lovecraft's habitual usages at the time, and make alterations as he thinks, as he thought would be correct as far as how Lovecraft wrote, if that makes any sense at all. But yeah, and so a lot of work went into Lovecraft's texts. And that's discouraging if you think that someday some editor somewhere is just going to be like, you know what, I'm just going to change this because it's offensive to our world now, to the people in the world now, to some of us anyway. It's disturbing because for many of us who are interested in H.P. Lovecraft and his work, we want to know his actual attitudes. We want to know what he actually wrote. We don't need the text to be censored. Now, an author should have the last word as far as the texts of their work is concerned. It shouldn't be an editor later coming in to change their work. Now, sometimes an author will go back years later and revise their own work. One that comes immediately to mind is Frankenstein. Frankenstein was published in 1818. Years later, Mary Shelley went back and altered the text in certain places. Now, both versions are available, and both versions should be available. I'm holding this up because this is the new annotated Frankenstein. This has the 1818 text, but it details all the changes that Mary Shelley made later on in the further editions of her work. The most common edition out there was from 1830. I can't remember at the top of my head. Was it 1832? I can't remember, but she went back and she altered it for the version that we normally read. Now, at this point, Mary Shelley was much older. Her attitudes had changed. And so she was basically a different person, altering the text of her younger self. Now, she is the author of the work. She has every right to do this. But fortunately, both versions survive, and both versions are important because Mary Shelley is important. This book is very important. So it's good to know all the changes that the author made and why the author made these changes. Artistically speaking, the earlier version is probably better, but it's good that both versions survive. Now, this isn't the only instance of this. H.G. Wells did the same thing when he came out with The Sleeper Awakes. The original version of this book, When the Sleeper Awakes, was written when he was younger. When he was older, some of the things in this book always bothered him. So he went back and changed it. Changed the title to The Sleeper Awakes. Now, this book is part of Roger's Cheapo Book Club. We're going to be reading this later on in the year. And you can, of course, read either version. This is the version, The Sleeper Awakes, that the older H.G. Wells preferred. There were things about the original version he just didn't like. So he went back and he altered some things and changed some things. Fortunately, again, in this case, both versions are available. And so we can see the different texts. We can see why he made the changes. And he explains in the newer edition why he made the changes that he made. Again, it was a case of an author thinking about his earlier work and years later revising it, as an author has every right to do. Now, this isn't a book it's not as important as Frankenstein, but H.G. Wells is a very important writer. So everything he wrote is of interest. It's important stuff. So having both texts is important. This isn't a tremendously popular book. It doesn't have anything that I could think of that's overly offensive in it, but you never know. The danger is, of course, that someday an editor will come around somewhere and alter this without telling anybody, or maybe he will tell you, but he'll alter it, and some publisher will publish a corrupted version of the text. An author can change the text after the book has been published. That's fine. It's their work. But once they're gone and they have no say in the changes that could be made, that's just wrong. Again, like I said, it's not just wrong to the author. And it doesn't matter that they're dead. A person should still be respected even if they're gone, and their work should be respected. And it's also bad for us who recognize the importance of these writers and want to know what they actually wrote in their books. There are some cases where there's a translation. Now, of course, if you're reading a translated piece of work, you can't read the exact words of the author because you can't read the language. I cannot read Les Mis, for example. And in that case, we just have to try to find the best translation that we could find. And it's best to look into it and see if there have been any alterations made from the text, if anything has been cut out. As far as this book is concerned, a lot of editions have stuff that's been cut out because Les Mis, it's a book with a lot of long digressions, and a lot of the digressions have nothing to do with the story. But Victor Hugo put it in the book, wanted it in the book, so it's got to stay there. And it's important that that stuff's still in here. So it's good to find a translation that sticks as close to the text and doesn't cut stuff out as, you know, as good a version as we could find. Translations are always going to be different. You're always going to have a lot of the translator's style in it. That's unavoidable. But try to find one, I think, that's as close to what the author actually presented as possible, if you can. Now, that's hard if you don't know, for example, French. But I do know that this edition is a complete edition, that none of the scenes, none of the text that's translated has been taken out. That's important. When it comes to classic works, it's good to try to find a publisher that's reputable, like the Library of America, for example, and look up this page, the note on the text. Always read that. Always read where the text, what sources are they using? What texts are they using? Because there's more than one text floating around out there for a lot of classic works. So that page, or that part of the book, is important. The note on the text. Always check that out, because the text matters. Roger totally agrees. Okay, I'll shut up now. I will catch you next time.